So this is a month of sermons inspired by the writings of popular author and UU minister Robert Fulghum. I thought I'd share with you this short reading, which is about people and trustworthiness. This is what he has to say. How about some good news for a change? Something to consider when you are in a people are no damn good mood. Here's a phrase we hear a lot. You can't trust anybody anymore. Doctors and politicians and merchants and salesmen. They're all out to rip you off, right? It ain't necessarily so. Man named Stephen Brill tested the theory in New York City with taxi cab drivers. Brill posed as a well-to-do foreigner with little knowledge of English. He got into several dozen taxis around New York City to see how many drivers would cheat him. His friends predicted in advance that most would take advantage of him in some way. One driver out of 37 cheated him. The rest took him directly to his destination and charged him correctly. Several refused to take him when his destination was only a block or two away, even getting out of their cabs to show him how close he already was. The greatest irony of all was that several drivers warned him that New York City was full of crooks and to be careful. You will continue to read stories of crookedness and corruption, of police who lie and steal, doctors who reap where they do not sow, politicians on the take. Don't be misled. They are news because they are the exceptions. The evidence suggests that you can trust a lot more people than you think. The evidence suggests that a lot of people believe that. A recent survey by Gallup indicates that 70% of the people believe that most people can be trusted most of the time. Who says people are no damn good? What kind of talk is that? So I think it's even more astonishing to note that this was written decades ago when New York City was known as a much meaner, angry place. And even then, the cab drivers, they proved to be generally trustworthy. And of course, this wasn't a scientific study, to say the least, but I think it still says something about when our perceptions don't necessarily align with reality. And that Gallup poll Fulghum referred to, a little more scientifically reliable, and it seems to reinforce the idea that most people believe that most other people are trustworthy. And on trust, Fulghum's take on it, it's simple, a very simple take on a very, very complex topic. But it makes sense. The idea that people are generally no good and can't be trusted is really not grounded in reality. It's a false narrative. And it's not spiritually helpful or life-affirming to believe that people cannot be trusted. If that's a belief one holds, I'd say it's a belief well worth letting go. But yet, I believe that most people, especially most UUs, do not buy into that false narrative. We typically have a much sunnier view of humanity. But yet, trust is complex, and it's worth looking into a little bit deeper. I know some of you out there must have heard of a scholar and author named Brené Brown, who has done some great work on trust. And Brené is becoming increasingly popular in UU circles. And I think it's because she has all the charisma of a pop psychology guru, but she has the academic street cred to back it up. She's a PhD researcher. Her assessments are backed up by science. The bio on her website is also kind of cool. It's headed researcher, storyteller, Texan. So what's not to like about that? She says, I'm a research professor at the University of Houston. I'm also a visiting professor in management at the University of Texas at Austin. I've spent the past 2 decades studying courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. So what does Brene have to say about trust? Well, her favorite definition of trust is provided by yet another author named Charles Feltman, who defines trust as choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. Let me say that again. That's a mouthful. Choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. And I think that key word in that definition is vulnerability. You can't trust if you can't open yourself to some measure of vulnerability. There's always a risk there in trusting. And I'll add that you can't be trustworthy if you are unable to hold safely the vulnerability of another person. So here's Brené's take on trust, the big picture, and then we'll go into some of the details. She says, trust is earned in the smallest of moments. It is earned not through heroic deeds or even highly visible actions, but through paying attention, listening, and gestures of genuine care and connection. So building trust is really about building relationships, and the same rules apply to both. And I'm struck by how many words in this description of trust building overlap with our own church covenant of positive relations. Some of the similarities are uncanny. It can't be a coincidence. But our covenant talks about the importance of listening and care and paying attention to one's impact on other people. One of my favorite UU readings says, covenant is an invitation to relationship. Covenant creates an environment in which relationships can grow and strengthen and deepen and flourish. And those relationships cannot grow and strengthen and deepen and flourish without trust. But anyway, let's get back to what Brene has to say. She uses a pretty cool metaphor when she talks about trust. It's a metaphor that came from her daughter when she was in elementary school. Her daughter's teacher had a marble jar. When the class was behaving, when everybody was getting along, when they were good citizens, the teacher would put marbles into the jar. When the kids were not behaving, when they were not getting along, when they were not being good citizens, the teacher would take marbles out of the jar. So the whole incentive with this game was for the class to work together so the marble jar became full so that they would get some kind of treat or privilege or reward. So when Brene talked through her young daughter about the marble jar, they came up with the idea that trust is like the marble jar. A lot of little moments go into building trust, like the little marbles going inside the jar. Brene and her daughter talked about what they called their marble jar friends, the friends who had achieved that level of trust, that trust so strong it was equivalent to a full jar of marbles. So what kind of behaviors end up becoming marbles that go into a jar of trust? And they really are indeed small. Some small examples. A marble jar behavior is a boss who remembers how to ask how your mom's chemotherapy is going. People who attend funerals get a lot of marbles. A friend who drops everything to talk you through a difficult situation. The list goes on and on again, but the similarity is that they are all relatively small things rather than grand gestures. You see, in our relationships, there are always tiny moments where there is an opportunity to either build trust or betray trust. To choose not to connect with someone at a critical time is a little betrayal. You know, not taking that phone call, choosing to not take that phone call from a friend in distress, or not listening to your spouse talk about the hard day they had. These are all moments of trust building or trust betraying. All of these tiny little daily interactions factor into what goes into that marble jar of trust. Brene says the people whose jars are full, people who have over time really done those small things that have helped us believe that they're worth hearing our story, They are the ones we should be sharing our story with. Brené Brown, through her research, she also developed something called the anatomy of trust. She went into social science research, interviews, surveys of people regarding how they felt about trust, to find all of the common qualities that build trusting relationships, to create a formula for trust. And she describes this anatomy of trust through an acronym. And her acronym is the word braving, BRAVING. 7 parts of the anatomy of trust are in the word braving. So I'm going to walk you through all the letters in braving and what they mean. B stands for boundaries. For trust to exist, both parties have to respect each other's boundaries, right? I think we've all met the person who won't take no for an answer, or will say or do intrusive things, or asks things of us we are uncomfortable with. That's bad boundaries, and bad boundaries undermine trust. The R in braving stands for reliability. I can only trust you if you do what you say you will do, and you are consistent in your words and actions over and over and over again. A lot of this makes sense from our own personal experience, right? The A in braving is accountability. I can only trust you if, when you make a mistake, you are willing to own it, apologize for it, and make amends. That is uncannily similar to some language in our covenant of positive relations. The V in braving is a little trickier. The V stands for vault. The vault is about where you keep confidences. And that makes a lot of sense. That's pretty easy to grasp. You trust people who can keep confidences. But the vault is about more than confidences held between 2 people. The vault also has to do with relationships beyond 2 people, with triangles and things like that. The vault has to do with things like gossip. Research shows that gossip between 2 people about a third party undermines trust. You'd think maybe you can bond over gossip, but ultimately it works the same way. And I think everyone has actually kind of experienced this before. If it doesn't take a genius to realize that the person who is always gossiping to you about someone else is also gossiping about you to other people, right? It just kind of figures that way. And so that's the kind of undermining of trust we're talking about in that behavior. The I in braving stands for integrity. And Brené, when she doesn't like existing definitions of a word, she builds a new definition based on her own research. So she created her own definition for integrity, and it's a 3-part definition. So integrity is 3 things. 1 is choosing courage over comfort. Number 2 is choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy. And number 3 is practicing your values, not just professing them. There's a lot there. There's a whole sermon just in that definition of integrity, but I think it all rings very true. All right, we're closing in. We're getting close to the end of the braving acronym here. We're on the N. The N stands for non-judgment. Trusted people are non-judgmental. It makes sense. We trust them because we can show them our vulnerable sides without fear of being perceived as weak or broken or even a whiner. It's because of judgment, right? We never really trust who's going to trust their harshest critic, right? But we are more likely to trust a non-judgmental person offering constructive advice, right? That's much easier to accept than judgment from a harsh critic. And non-judgment also means having mutually helpful relationships in which both people feel free to ask for help and not be judged about needing help. And they also don't judge themselves for asking for or needing help. It's kind of counterintuitive, but if you are willing to ask for help when you need it, you are seen as more trustworthy than a person who never ever admits or asks for help. Something to think about there. So the final letter in the anatomy of trust in the Braving acronym is G. And G stands for generosity, not the kind you'd think of. Brene says, our relationship is only a trusting relationship if you can assume the most generous thing about my words, intentions, and behaviors. So if I screw up, say something wrong, forget something, you will make a generous assumption about it and then check in with me about it. Now, this idea is expressed a lot in UU covenants. We usually phrase it as assuming good intentions, right? And you can see how always assuming good intentions instead of just jumping to believing the worst about someone is a healthy step towards building trust. So I'm going to quickly recap that acronym, the Braving. We've got boundaries, reliability, accountability, the vault, integrity, non-judgment, and generosity. And these are the qualities that came up in the research about trusting relationships. Or, just for learning, we can phrase it another way. I can give you a list of the qualities that undermine trust. It's the don't do list. Well, those don't do things are things like being inconsistent and non-inclusive and secretive and withholding, controlling behavior, being judgmental, gossiping, self-centered behavior, failing to stand up for your values and for others, and jumping to negative conclusions about others, and failing to take responsibility. The Braving acronym can be really useful to identify what might be wrong when there are trust issues in a relationship. So it's not just a theory, it's something that can actually be used as a tool to help. And this can work in personal relationships and professional ones as well. You can look at something and say, well, what is the problem here? Are we having a boundaries issue? Or is this a judgment issue? What is the nature of this? And Braving, also very importantly, is applicable to self-trust. Often after we mess up something, we lose trust in ourselves, which really is not a healthy thing. But the Braving acronym can help us figure out where our internal trust issues are coming from. So I believe that one of the biggest takeaways for today, for us as Unitarian Universalists, when considering trust, is the importance of covenant when it comes to creating an environment in which trust can be established and grow, so that relationships may be established and grow. The fact that Brené's science-based anatomy of trust and our own covenant match up so well, that's really heartening, because it tells us that if we abide by covenant, we will have more healthy, trusting, and deeper relationships and be able to work together and be together more successfully as a congregation. It also proves that covenant is much more than a bunch of fluffy words. Most of its recommendations are actually backed by science, and we are a science-believing people, aren't we? So if you ask more about what is the role of trust in Unitarian Universalism, I can say that our covenants are all about building trust and relationships and community. That trust is foundational to our ability to function as a community of faith. Without trust, there is really not much we can actually accomplish together. And although the word trust is not present in our 7 principles, I think it's fair to say that really not a single one principle out of the whole 7 can work if we don't have some baseline of trust in our fellow human beings. Now, I will leave it to you all to go to uua.org/principles and test and see if any of those principles can hold true or work without a trusting attitude regarding people and regarding humanity. That trust is built in our DNA. It is so foundational, yet we don't talk about it very often. And I think that really does need to change talking about the importance of trust in building church community. So I'd like to leave you today with some words from Adrienne Marie Brown, not related to Brene Brown. She is an activist, she's an author, and she's a facilitator and consultant for activist groups. And she wrote a book recently called Emerging Strategy. And she talks about how a primary principle of her strategy is called trusting the people. So she writes, trust the people who move towards you and already feel like home. Trust the people to let you rest. Trust the people to do everything better than you could have ever imagined. Trust the people and they become trustworthy. Trust that the people are doing their work to trust themselves. Trust that each breach of trust can deepen trust or clarify boundaries. Trust the people who revel in pleasure after hard work. Trust the people who let children teach and remind us how to emote, be still, and laugh. Trust the people who see and hold your heart. Trust the people who listen to the whales. Trust the people and you will become trustworthy. Trust the people and show them your love. Trust the people. I think Adrienne Marie Brown tells us that trust only works as a two-way street. It is true that trust must be earned, but it is earned through a process that is reciprocal and mutual, a process that is really vital to absolutely everything we do. So I hope you will take some time to think about the role of trust in your life and your relationships today. Blessed be and amen. All right, it's that special time in our service now where we have the virtual offering. As I always make a point to say, I want to thank you everyone for keeping up so well on your pledges. It's terrific. It's really, it's provided us with a lot of security that we can keep going in this difficult time, and it is so appreciated. So thank you very much. So you might take this time to write a monthly check to prepare to, for the church to prepare to mail tomorrow, or set up an auto check coming from your bank account. You can also give online through the link in the chat or on the instructions on your screen. Just be mindful that credit card gifts charge a higher amount of fees than other methods. And I just wanted to remind you again that our church, although we are not allowed in the building, it has not stopped. And all of your efforts will ensure that there is a church to come back to when everything is clear and we are allowed to do so safely. Our offering will now be given and gratefully received. So now I'm going to extinguish our chalice after these words from Michael A. Schuler. Cherish your doubts, for doubt is the servant of truth. Question your convictions, for beliefs too tightly held strangle the mind and its natural wisdom. Suspect all certitudes, for the world whirls on. Nothing abides. Yet in our inner rooms full of doubt, inquiry, and suspicion, let a corner be reserved for trust. For without trust, there is no space for communities to gather or for friendships to be forged. Indeed, this is the small corner where we connect and reconnect with each other. Amen.